Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast. Now, if someone told me that 2005 was their favorite year for Asian horror, I'm not sure I could find a strong argument against them. Of the 48 movies I've seen from this particular year, I enjoyed 32 of them. That's a crazy success percentage. And if that weren't impressive enough, some of these films are all-time classics, in my opinion. So I'm just going to spoil it for you right here and say that this was a very good year for the industry. But it didn't stop some people from complaining back in the day. Our good friends at Midnight Eye contributed one of the least convincing articles in that impressive website's illustrious career. It was entitled The Death of J Horror, with a question mark, and was a long-winded exercise in complaining that introduced some surprisingly weak arguments in its defense. And it's not like that article was written at the beginning of this particular year, before all of these movies came out. Oh no, it was written on December 22nd, 2005, at the very tail end of this year. Now I look back at all of the good Japanese horror films that were released during 2005, as well as all of the ones released during the following 10 years, and I just have to shake my head. Of the 32 Asian horror films from 2005 that I actually enjoyed, 21 of them were Japanese, including 4 of the top 5. And there was a great variety of films in this year as well. So what were these guys complaining about? I don't know, man. But don't worry, because I plan on tackling that dubious article in one of my feature videos for next year. But what I will say right now is this, okay? I've been hearing this, I would call it whining, about the death of J-horror and the death of Asian horror for 10 years now. I've been hearing this. And since the argument was so obviously ill-conceived back then, I can only assume that 10 years from now, in 2026, I will still be enjoying my Japanese horror films and shaking my head when I hear people say that it died way back in 2004. But with that said, we've got some movies to review today. And we'll get to the honorable mentions in part 2 of this video. But, as always, titles for all of the movies I discuss are listed in the description box below. So, after complaining myself about the whining on the Asian horror film industry, of course part 1 of these videos focuses on the least impressive films from this particular year. How ironic. So we begin, as always, with the worst Asian horror film from this particular year, and it's an easy choice for 2005, a very easy choice. And that film is ID. I should say spelled I-D, a Japanese horror film. Now, I would read the official plot synopsis, but I'm not going to, because it gives the impression of an interesting, surrealistic film about a serial killer, psychology, and spiritualism. Yeah, not even close. Instead, I'll read you a nice plot summary from the worldwide Celluloid Massacre website. This indescribable movie follows a mysterious murderer, excuse me, an abusive pig farm owner, his huge sons whom he feeds like animals, one of which is a cross-dresser, and some abused women and villagers, all who live in a small village and spend most of the movie yelling, beating, raping, abusing, and murdering, while jerking their penises made of machine parts. That was a quote from that website, and it accurately describes this movie. And there are basically 2 words that I would use to describe this pile of crap. Actually, I may have just described it. But the 2 words I was thinking of were juvenile and irritating. So basically, this is about a group of inbred Japanese hillbillies who act hysterical and grunt a lot. That's about it for this film. And it goes on for 104 minutes. It's no understatement to say that this film reaches a level of superlative annoyance that's rarely achieved in cinema. There are a few attempts at humor that fall flat on their face, and the acting is just not good overall. Not good. Now, there are a few decent moments of atmosphere and or gore, but those are greatly outweighed by the sheer obnoxiousness of the rest of the film. I've seen some reviews online that go into philosophical diatribes and brainstorms about the id of human beings, but I think this is one of those cases where people are taking the title of the film, id, then they think up all kinds of ideas in their head, and then read those ideas back into the film, when the film itself gives us nothing to think about at all. So, if you haven't noticed, I really hate this movie, and I hate it with a burning passion. I would say that if you want to watch a film from this particular director who hasn't directed much, I would say go watch Organ from 1996 instead, for an example of how this director can do something fairly good. So id takes the place as the worst Asian horror film from 2005. Congratulations, it's well deserved. Now the next film here is not much better, and that is The Monster, also known as Home Sweet Home, and this is a Hong Kong horror film. Now, a woman moves into a new apartment in Hong Kong with her husband and son. During the move-in, the mother and son see a hideously deformed being. Well, that's not good. They tell the father about what they've seen, and he actually suggests moving out, which is not something you frequently see in horror films. Usually, the father just doesn't believe what his children or wife are seeing. He's like, nah, let's stay here. This guy has some common sense and wants to move out. However, having already paid a lot for their new home, the mother actually decides that they should remain. So, yeah, it's not the best decision. This is a badly written, overdramatic, and cheesy film. The birthday party scene in particular is a prime example of all of these negative qualities. There's during that scene, the mother has this slow motion running scene that is just outrageously artificial and terribly directed. Now, the two lead actresses in this film are Shu Qi and Karina Lam, both of which were in good horror films that we covered in 2004. Shu Qi was in The Eye 2, and Karina Lam was in Coma. But this is a huge step down for both of these actresses. It was terrible. In fact, I would say that Shu Qi's acting was very amateurish here, not one of her better performances. And that's throughout the entire film. It's just not a good performance. And the child actor in this is just terrible. I previously mentioned the poor script writing, and here's another example here. I found it funny how, dozens of cops search the apartment complex when things are reported to them, and they search it over and over again, and they unsuccessfully find this, hideously deformed being. Yet, as soon as they leave, our protagonist is capable of finding this thing in 5 minutes. It's just come on, man. This movie stinks. It stinks. I don't hear people talk about it much, and that's a good thing. And I think it's deserved to just be ignored. Don't watch it. Alright, so the next film here is it's an underwhelming installment in a popular franchise that we've been covering. And that is Tomie Revenge from Japan. So this is the 7th film in the Tomie franchise. Kind of surprising that we've covered that many so far, but we actually covered only 5 of the first 6 because the 6th entry, Tomie Beginning, also came out during 2005 and was a better film than Tomie Revenge. So we'll get to that one a little bit later in a future part of this video. But what about Tomie Revenge? Well, the story revolves around a young female doctor and an unidentified naked woman she runs down on the road one night. In her search for the wounded girl, who has a mole under her left eye, the doctor ends up in an abandoned house filled with bodies, madmen, and an unconscious girl. So then she discovers Tomie, and madness begins yet again. Now this premise sounds kind of like a streamlined, simplistic, fun entry for fans of Tomie, but it ultimately proves to be a gigantic piece of crap. Quite possibly the worst of the entire franchise. It starts off kind of okay, with some dreamy lighting and a mysterious plot, but near the 10-minute mark, it steadily begins to nosedive. In fact, I would say around 8-minute mark, I just started shaking my head, because I was like, man, this is bad acting. there are some really cheesy moments in this one. For example, there's this crazy dude, like this random crazy guy who runs around and acts obnoxiously like throughout the whole film. He's completely unwatchable every time he's on screen. He just completely takes you out of the film. He's terribly acted. It's, oh man, whoever decided to include this guy, I don't know what you were thinking, because this is a Tomie film, not a nutty, like, I don't know, crazy dude film. Man. And then there's also some annoying close-up camera shots of people's faces. At times, they're actually screaming into the camera. So just imagine, like, a camera, like, zooming into somebody's face and they're screaming, like, right at you. I think in one of the shots, the camera goes inside the guy's mouth and then transitions to another scene. Like, that's how bad this is. Oh, not good. The script is very flimsy, and it's incapable of filling the runtime overall. The supporting actors give poor performances, and the Tomie bite scenes, as I call them, are stupid and embarrassing. You'll know what I'm talking about if you choose to suffer through this one. It doesn't even feel really like a Tomie film. It's more like a C-grade knockoff with no cinematic flair at all. I should have checked. I wanted to check to see if this was direct-to-DVD, because it feels like it's direct-to-DVD in its home country. Just, it doesn't have that cinematic flair, you know what I mean? And there's so many problems with it. Even fans of the Tomie franchise, man, you're really taking a chance with this one. So I do not recommend it. All right, our next film here, we stay in Japan, unfortunately, for a film that had some potential, and that film is called Gurozuka. A college movie club was shut down when one member disappeared and another was hospitalized after suffering a nervous breakdown. Now, 7 years later, a small group of college girls restart the club and travel to a desolate house in the woods to shoot a horror movie that is based on the events that led to the organization's closure. Now, after they arrive, they watch an 8mm tape they found in the club room, which depicts a gruesome murder perpetrated by someone in a no mask using a meat cleaver. So, they sit around and debate if the movie is real or not, but then they discovered that the no mask and cleaver, which were going to be used for the movie, have gone missing. Uh-oh, there's trouble around the corner. I mean, who would use a real meat cleaver? Never mind. I'm not even going to bother. So as you may have guessed, this is not a good movie. It's basically a slasher film, alright, which means that the script writing doesn't necessarily have to be anything spectacular for the film to be entertaining. As long as you pace things properly, keep things moving, and contribute some cool death scenes. It can be an enjoyable experience. Unfortunately, there's a ton of boring filler to wade through in Gurozuka. And there are no good death scenes at all. None at all. Not even one good death scene. That's a big no-no, man. When you have a slasher and there's no good death scenes at all, that's a problem. It also relies too much on jump scares. I mean, come on. Which is a big no-no for me. You know, another big no-no. That's another big no-no. On a positive side, if I have to say something positive, the acting is decent, I guess, and the tree-lined environments are a good setting, but you have to go right back to the negatives because the atmosphere comes off as weak because these natural environments are not properly amplified by, like, good camera work, direction, or scoring or lighting. You know what I mean? It's like they don't take advantage of the environment that they're in. If they had some better scoring and some cool, moody lighting, it would have made this movie easier to sit through. But as is, it's a hard sit, man. It's hard to sit through this. Do not recommend it. Gurozuka, a big flat failure, in my opinion. That was a blind buy, too. I have that in my DVD collection. Ugh. So next is a film is from Hong Kong, unfortunately. Gets to contribute to an unimpressive film. And that is Futago. Now, this one has a pretty interesting premise here. After moving to Hong Kong with the hopes of becoming a pop singer, a young Japanese woman mysteriously disappears, and her creepy twin sister subsequently arrives at the motel where she previously stayed. But the residents within this location begin to act very suspiciously. Now, the viewer is posed with a question or a dilemma. You have to ask yourself, did they have a hand in causing this girl's disappearance, or are they simply freaked out by her creepy sister? Now, the opening 5 or so minutes in this are actually quite good, but afterward, this movie is unimpressive in just about every aspect. There are too many undeveloped subplots thrown into the mix, and it would have been beneficial if the scriptwriters simply focused entirely on the primary story. For example, this burnt-out cop shows up, and it just feels so unnecessary because he's one of the most cliched, boring characters in this story. If he would have been excluded entirely and they just focused on the main story, it would have been a little bit better. Acting all around is weak. At times it's okay. I will say, though, that the cinematography and the visuals are pretty good here, and the introduction of the idea that a woman can coerce others through mental influence is an interesting theme, but it's not explored that well. Poorly executed, and for the most part, this is a dull experience. An opportunity wasted, I think. I remember when I first heard about this one, I got a little excited. You have kind of the twin thing going on, you got some mental coercion going on, a little bit of possible multidimensionality here with the characters, but it doesn't really take advantage. Do not recommend it. The next film here is another one that, has a pretty interesting premise but goes nowhere with it, and that is White Panic, also known as Fu-rai, a Japanese horror film. Now, one day, 4 young people, 3 men and a woman, wake up in the morning and they find themselves in a small room filled with white powder, naked. So they're naked and there's white powder everywhere in this white room. So why have they been brought here? And what is this room meant to be? And who brought them to this mysterious room? And most of all, how can they escape? So that's kind of it's kind of one of those flicks where you're in this place and there's all these questions open and hopefully they'll get answered at the end. But here's the deal with these movies that are set in one location, all right? You need good character interaction to make it work. Otherwise, things get boring. And let me tell you, White Panic certainly gets boring, even frustrating at times. Characters are annoying. Oh, man. I mean, you're stuck in this room with these characters and you make some of them annoying. Ugh. Not good. The performances are poor. Some pretty poor acting here. The horror sequences are very lame. You would expect something good. No. And the premise never becomes interesting. At no point during this film while I was watching it was I invested in what was happening on screen. I simply just did not care about anything throughout the entire runtime. And there was a noticeable lack of excitement and memorable sequences. All I remember from this movie is the white room itself. When I was, I saw this years ago, but still, I did some research on it. I read up on the plot again, and I'm like, man, I don't really remember any of the characters in this, and I don't remember, how it concluded. I literally don't remember the whole end of this movie. Can't be good. So, I do not recommend it. Now, next here on our list are two of the less impressive Asian horror anthologies from this era. Now, I am going to group my reviews of these 2 films together because they are similar in style and form and were produced by the same company. So, we are talking about, of course, J-horror anthology Underworld and J-horror anthology Legends, both of which are expectedly from Japan. So each of these titles represents an anthology of 6 short films averaging 15 minutes each, meaning that, in total, these 2 anthologies contribute 12 short films. But since I don't particularly like them, I will first give you the overall reasons for my dissatisfaction, then I will very briefly discuss the storylines and then give a 1-sentence, or in some cases, 1-word response to each individual short film. Now, my overall gripes here begin with the very low production values and spotty acting, which quickly put these anthologies behind the 8 ball right from the start. Low budgets have not stopped us. Remember now, low budgets have not stopped us from enjoying some anthologies that we've previously covered in this playlist, such as, Prayer Beads, or the Kadokawa Mystery and Horror Tales set. But you have to give me some good atmosphere and scares, or some good drama. Underworld and Legends are unfortunately lacking in those elements, and with only 15 minutes dedicated to each short film, you're not going to get much in terms of story or character development. So, I actually thought that the short introduction segments that were in between the stories are the best parts of these anthologies, because at least they have some interesting monologue. You have like this, I don't know if you would call him like a host, this like goofy looking dude who gives you a little bit of a flavor, like a 30-second intro before each story begins. He gives you a little creepy segment into it. And he's my favorite part of this. The actual stories themselves, not so much. So let's briefly cover these individual stories, shall we? And forgive me for not getting into more detail on these, but I haven't seen them in a while, and they suffer from the same flaws in general anyways. So we begin with J-horror anthology Underworld first. The first story is Chainmail, where three friends use a fellow student's death to send a chainmail voice or phone message with unintended results. This one is mediocre and forgettable. Next is Left Behind on the Mountain, where an arrogant jerk picks up girls and leaves them deserted on the mountain when they won't, make out with them. What a freaking jerk. Now, fortunately, this scumbag gets an unwelcome surprise one evening. But as nice as it is to see this guy get what he deserves, this segment's just okay at best. In Tattoo, a girl gets a butterfly tattoo and also gets more than what she bargained for. This one has some good atmosphere to it, better than some of the other segments, but it does get pretty stupid at times as well. So even this one has some pretty good atmosphere, but still kind of fails. Next comes Viewfinders Memory, where three friends visit a beach and meet a familiar but strange girl. And it's only after they begin shooting vacation videos that they learn her secret. This one, I would thought was just lame, is what I would call this one. In Guardian Angel, a destitute girl who squandered her grandmother's inheritance attempts to pay off her debts with her life. Forgettable is my description of that one. And lastly is Mortuary, where an intern has to deal with a grieving mother in a hospital mortuary. Mostly boring. It's sleep-inducing, this one. So, these anthologies are like the exact opposite of something like Prayer Beads, where every short film in Prayer Beads had something to admire and something that made it watchable. It seems like every short story in this one, it seems like even if it has a few good things, it just ultimately just caves in on itself. So let's move on to J-horror anthology Underworld. You have Pony Lamp. The first story is a classic samurai ghost tale that is very similar to some of the films that we covered when we explored the 1950s and 1960s. But it's one of the lesser versions of these samurai horror films. You're better off just watching one of those instead. This one isn't very good. Now, She-Bear. Here's an exception here. She-Bear is the second story here, and it's a non-stop slasher about a homeless woman, teddy bear in hand, who cuts the ears and fingers off of unsuspecting schoolgirls. Now, I gotta say, this has some solid suspense sequences and is easily the most entertaining short film that is showcased in either of these two anthologies. So, if you're actually able to find She-Bear on YouTube or somewhere else, it's worth watching, but I don't think it's worth watching both of these entire anthologies just to get to that one. Now, the third short story here in J-horror anthology Underworld is Yamanba, and it's based on an ancient lore and concerns a mountain spirit that deceives and attacks people who pass by. I found this one to be very stupid, I guess is what my description would be. Nurariyan, number 4, is about a young boy who actually befriends a demon, which proves useful when trouble comes. So this one's a little bit different, but also it's just overall low quality. Did not like it. In Heartbroken Trip number 5, a young woman is terrorized by supernatural entities while she waits for her friend to arrive. Run of the mill. Run of the mill is my description. And finally, Lost Souls. The final and 6th segment of this particular anthology is about a haunted lake where a family suicide previously took place. And overall, I say again, run of the mill. So overall, I really was not a fan of these short films in either of these anthologies. But, you know what? Reading the basic plot synopses, it seems like they do mix things up a little bit. And, I don't know, if I have a lazy night one night, I might give them a second chance. Because horror anthologies really interest me, and this does have some good reviews online. Actually, both of these anthologies have pretty good reviews online, so I kind of question my consistent disappointment in almost all of these stories. But with that said, I have to go with my first impression, because remember when I said that Scary True Stories, the anthology we discussed while we were covering 1992, was not particularly good, but I was going to rewatch it. Well, I did rewatch it. But I came away just as unimpressed as I did years ago when I saw it the first time. So sometimes it's best to go with your first impression, and these Underworld and Legends anthologies were just not very good. Plenty of better Asian horror anthologies to watch, certainly. Now we come to the next one here, which is about a really cool urban legend, but this is not the one to start with. If you're interested in this Japanese urban legend, do not start with this particular film, because you will come away disappointed. And that is The Slit-Mouthed Woman, a Japanese exploitation horror film. Alright, so what makes this exploitation? Well, you're about to see. So a young couple enter a hospital after rumors that a demonic spirit known as the Slit-Mouthed Woman have been seen there. And once inside, they are possessed by an overwhelming desire to have sex. So they sneak off into an empty room to satiate their lusts. Then, out of the darkness, a perverse and disfigured woman appears and confronts them. Now, this movie is based on the popular Slit-Mouthed Woman legend of Japan, also known as Kuchisake-Onna. Now, I was going to provide some history regarding this legend here, but this film doesn't deserve that treatment because it's a nudie flick, and that's basically all it is. Meaning that there's lots of sex and nudity, but not much in terms of overall quality. It does try to make a few statements on like plastic surgery and vanity and stuff, but it's very thin and on content, and it fails quite badly. Frights are mediocre as well. Only 63 minutes long, but it seemingly takes forever to finish. So, a word of warning, okay, another word of warning is that some people confuse this movie with the film Carved from 2007, which is also based on the Slit-Mouthed Woman legend. That movie is actually somewhat entertaining, so I will cover the legend itself behind all of this stuff when we get to that particular film. And there are actually a number of films that are based on the Slit-Mouthed Woman legend. A lot of people just know like Carved and maybe this nudie flick, because it's also been released in the United States, believe it or not, on DVD. And those are the two films that kind of get confused with one another. But there are a handful of other films that have been released, a few of which are very good, that we will cover later on. So, I do not recommend The Slit-Mouthed Woman. But again, don't get it confused with the other titles here that are more than worthy of being watched. So we got one more film left here. And, our final film from this year will have a familiar title to you. If you've seen some of my prior videos in this playlist, this one will be familiar. Why, you may ask? Well, that's because it's yet another installment of the Shake, Rattle, and Roll franchise. And that is Shake, Rattle, and Roll 7, also known as Shake, Rattle, and Roll 2K5, because sometimes it's just cool to do things like that. Now, the previous film in this franchise, Shake, Rattle, and Roll 6, was released back in 1997, so they waited a whole 8 long years before continuing with this property. So the question is this: have they gotten their act together? because most of those other installments were unimpressive, and even the watchable ones were nothing special. Now, consider me the bringer of bad news, my friends, because Shake, Rattle, and Roll 7 is still just as run-of-the-mill as most of its previous installments. It's an anthology of 3 short horror films, so let's run through these very briskly, please. In Poso, a fake occultist retires from the business of communicating with the dead when her last job goes terribly wrong. But when a wealthy client promises her a huge fee to contact a dead grandson, the occultist simply can't confuse, and that turns out to be a mistake, since this is a horror film. So together with her assistants in crime, they take on this last job, only to realize that they may not live to see another day. So this is a horror comedy, okay, so that you understand that, but it suffers from the same flaws that plague many of the other horror comedies in the Shake, Rattle, and Roll franchise. It's the humor isn't funny, and the scare tactics are lazy. Not good. Now, the second film here is called Aquarium. A family has moved into a new condo unit, but they are terrorized by a creature lurking in an aquarium left behind by the previous tenants. So, this benefits from taking a more serious angle. It doesn't have that lame humor from the Pozo segment. But the problem is that it lacks the horrific and or dramatic chops to make the this more serious strategy impactful. So it tries the more serious route. It's a little bit more ambitious in that regard, but it's still a failure. And the third film here in this anthology is Lihin. I think that's how you pronounce it. The residents of a sleepy rural town are alarmed when a man and his pregnant wife arrive. For obvious reasons if you decide to watch it. Now, that's fairly dull stuff that incorporates the Aswang monster, which we've covered a handful of times previously. This one just, it ain't worth watching, man. Go watch Impactita from 1989 instead. That's a pretty solid Aswang film. Watch that one instead. Skip this one. I almost feel like every time I have to review these Shake, Rattle, and Roll films, it's just painful, man. It feels like I keep saying the same thing over and over again, doesn't it? The comedy doesn't work, low quality stuff, the scare tactics are cheap and lazy. It's like I'm on a record. Just replay me over and over again when I cover a Shake, Rattle, and Roll film. How does this franchise last for so long? Oh, and they got more of them. Luckily, I stopped at like number 10 or something, but man, just don't bother. So that's part 1, a fairly painful part, I should say, of our excursion into Asian horror films released during 2005, but I promise it gets much better. And be sure to join me for part 2, where we'll finish off some of the less impressive films and then break into some of the more watchable stuff. And we're definitely going to get to some awesome stuff later on, so hang in there, people, hang in there. And as always, we'll see you next time.